Good afternoon from Tallinn to everyone. A very warm welcome to the panel entitled Great Power Competition in the New Decade. My name is Piret Pernik and I'm a researcher at the strategy branch at the CCDCOE. It's my great pleasure to moderate this panel with two distinguished scholars, Professor Martin Libicki and Jason Plessing. Unfortunately, our first speaker could not join us today due to an unexpected family emergency, and we wish him and his family a quick recovery and well. The good news is that after two presentations, we will have more time for discussion, and I encourage everyone to, as usual, to submit your questions via a chat box. And also, you don't have to limit yourself to the papers, but take the opportunity to ask our experts about broader issues regarding the great power competition concerning emerging and disruptive technologies and military cyber power. So the first paper in this session is co-authored by Professor Libicki and David Compert, and it's about quantum communications and its usefulness for both high and low-end cybersecurity. And the second paper, authored by Dr. Plessing, presents results of a unique database on global military cyber forces, and offers a new typology of organizational models and scale of command. And both themes are directly relevant to our discussions, as this summer NATO will be issuing new strategies on AI and data, as well as the renewal of implementation strategy of its emerging and disruptive technologies roadmap, which was first published in February 2001. And also it's renewing, as we heard yesterday from David Van Wiel, its cyber defense policy, which has implications for the allied cyberspace capabilities. So now I will introduce our speakers, and by the way, you can access their full bios at the conference webpage. Professor Libicki holds the Kaiser Chair of Cybersecurity Studies at the US Naval Academy, and he's author of several textbooks on cyber war, and other cyberspace relevant issues, as well as several monographs. And he has also contributed 6 articles to our own proceedings. A very warm welcome, Professor Libicki. And our second speaker, Dr. Jason Plessing, is a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and also fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Welcome, Jason, to you as well. And without further ado, I propose, as we now have more time, you both would have your presentations, and after that we will take the questions, have a discussion with the whole panel. So with that, over to you, Professor Libicki.
Good. Thank you for that warm introduction. Good afternoon, good morning, and a special shout out to the midshipmen. Let's talk about an approach to a new technology here. And we're going to start off with a background slide. And I suspect after several days here, no, the one before that, sorry. No, excuse me, you're right. That one, good. This is stuff that you probably spent several days talking about, and I'll just summarize the points really quickly. When you have a pandemic that keeps a lot of folks at home, people have to access workspaces from their home. Generally speaking, home computers tend to be less secure. The requirement that people be connected in order to do any work goes up. This creates potential vulnerabilities. When you have potential vulnerabilities, you have cyber criminals state actors, etc., taking advantage of the vulnerabilities. This makes cybersecurity more difficult. But the point I want to get to is the belief that cybersecurity investments are no longer as cost effective as they used to be. They are insufficiently cost effective. The world spends a minimum of about $100 billion a year on cybersecurity. The problem isn't going away. For all intents and purposes, it's getting worse. And when you have a problem like that, where the current technologies don't give you the kind of relief that you're hoping to get, there is a tendency to look for new technologies. And the new technology that a lot of people have in mind for information technology, for IT uses, is quantum. Okay? Now, you may ask yourself, what is quantum? What is quantum physics? And if you take a look at the next slide, which is taken from the New Yorker, I don't know how well you can read this, but this nurse is telling Dr. Schrodinger, about your cat, Dr. Schrodinger, I have good news and bad news. Well, those of you who understand it won't need an explanation from me. And those of you who don't understand it, I don't have time for an explanation, and I'm probably not very good at it anyway. So just take my word for it. This stuff is strange. So let's go to the next slide, where we talk about the technology in particular. When we talk about quantum technologies in the world of IT, there are actually three related technologies, one of which, ironically, creates a need for the other one. Those quantum technologies are quantum sensing, quantum computation, and quantum communications. The one that you may have heard about a lot is quantum computing. In 1994, Dr. Shor from, I believe, the Bell Labs basically argued convincingly that if you had a quantum computer, you could crack prime numbers. In other words, you could factor a large number into its component primes in polynomial time rather than exponential time. And if you could do that successfully, you would be able to essentially crack the key to asymmetric encryption. Asymmetric encryption, for the most part, has relied on prime numbers and has relied on the difficulty, sort of a logarithmic exponential difficulty of factoring prime numbers. If you go from an exponential difficulty to a polynomial difficulty, then all of a sudden it becomes possible, not only for nation states, but for anybody who can afford a quantum computer, to be able to crack asymmetric technology, which in turn undermines symmetric cryptology, because asymmetric cryptology is one of the ways used for passing keys for symmetric cryptology. And that's basically the backbone of all secret communications. Okay, but as it turns out, quantum physics has another trick up its sleeve, and that's called quantum communications. Now, the reason for that other trick up its sleeve is that while prime numbers are not the only possible way to do asymmetric encryption, people have talked about elliptical curves, for instance. There is no guarantee that these alternatives to prime numbers are themselves not crackable. In many ways, Dr. Shor did the world a favor by basically saying, hey, if you're going to have quantum computers, you can't rely on prime numbers to keep a secret. The problem is not with him. The problem is with the next Dr. Shor, who may find ways of cracking what we think are quantum-resistant encryption methods, but don't publish the results. Okay? So the question about whether some future algorithm, some future encryption method is going to protect our secrets is an open one. With quantum communications, however, you have a completely different approach to cryptology. Accordingly, it is understood within the world of quantum physics that you can provably detect whether a bit stream has been examined by a third party. Okay, now, I don't want to get into an argument about what the word provably means. But let's accept that as face value because it involves physics and not mathematics, which means it goes through a really different logic chain. And what that means is if you could provably know that you have sent a message and it hasn't been read, you can use this method to send symmetric keys. Because symmetric keys, even though they're extremely difficult to crack, at the same time have a primary weakness, and that's the key distribution function, particularly when you're communicating over an open medium. Quantum key distribution, the same technologies, can also be used for sending short messages. Now, one can go into a sort of a long exegesis about how do you know that the message, how do you communicate that a message has in fact been read, has been sent and not read reliably? And the answer is you don't. Okay, you don't have to do that. What you can do is you can take the first unread message and that use those bits as part of a bit stream to encode further messages using something like XOR methods or something comparable. Okay, and without going to a large amount of explanation, this is a relatively reliable method for passing messages back and forth, not only messages having to do with quantum key distribution, but short, otherwise critical messages. Okay, but note, this is a very different form of encryption than the one that we're used to. We're used to basically saying, I have sent a message to you. I don't know whether it's intercepted, but I know it doesn't make a difference because if you can't crack the key. Here you're sending a message and you're saying, it might be intercepted, but I'll know that. Okay, but if it isn't intercepted, I will also know that, and then I can use that message for further communications. Now, this, I'm going to argue in this slide, the rest of this slide and the next slide, is not the be-all and end-all of cybersecurity. Because what you often have in cybersecurity is a particularly elegant solution to a problem, but the problem is not the entire problem that you're dealing with. Okay? So in this case, if you take a look at how people intercept messages, how people crack systems, it turns out you're looking for vulnerabilities, whether vulnerabilities in code or vulnerabilities in how things are processed throughout the entire chain, from the integrity and trustworthiness of a recipient, of the sender, to the integrity and trustworthiness of the receiver, the machines that they work on, the intermediate nodes that they work on, etc. All I can do with quantum key distribution is to make sure that once a message leaves my machine, it is not intercepted. I will know whether or not it's intercepted when it arrives at the other machine. Okay? Now, from this, you have to work your way backwards to a problem. Remember that we already have more or less adequate methods for ensuring that a bit stream cannot be read by the other side. Okay? What we're worried about are not your common everyday criminals. What we're worried about are state actors that can intercept the physics, the physical manifestation of the bit stream and decrypt it. At the same time, when you talk about quantum key distribution, you're talking about something fairly expensive. So let's go to the next slide and pick up the points that we have there, okay? Okay, so it won't solve everything. We're taking a look at those communications that are imperiled by state actors, largely state actors, and we are talking about a currently expensive process. But it's, I would say, essential to understanding cybersecurity, to understand that different markets have different needs. Okay? The needs of the everyday user are different in scope and type than the needs of people who run telecommunications companies, are different in scope and type than the needs of people who run power plants. Let's go to the next slide. I think that makes it a little clearer here. are different than militaries, different from hospitals, different from banks, different from energy providers, and so on. Okay? Each of them has a different suite of adversaries. Each of them has adversaries that are looking for something, and each of them have different things they have to protect. Alluding to the previous presentation, okay? We talk about protecting confidentiality, integrity, and availability. But in some cases, confidentiality is your most important product, and in other cases, it's integrity, and yet in other cases, it's availability. So between the differences in the threats, the type of things that you want to protect, and the differences in threat actors, whereas there's commonalities, there are also very large differences. And it's the existence of these large differences which give a technology such as quantum key distribution and in the other quantum communications applications a chance to grow and thrive. Okay. Now, if we were to leave it at that, we would solve a fraction of a problem that occurs to a fraction of the community. The question is, if we get that right, and so far we're at the experimental stage to know that it's feasible, do we leave it go at that? Okay, and there are three alternatives, I would say. If the question is, okay, we have an expensive technology for expensive uses, how do we get this down market? The three options are, one, it's not going to go down market. It's not going to go to where the everyday citizen can take direct advantage of it, but that's okay. The second one is that it will go down market on its own. And the third one is that it should go down market, but we can't count on it to go down market on its own. And maybe it needs a little push. Okay, so let's take a look at the next slide. Okay. There are a lot of technologies that go down market. Okay. And there's grounds for believing that quantum cryptology or quantum technologies in general will not go down market. When 1994, when Shor wrote his algorithm, it was believed in the technology community that quantum computing was just around the corner. Here it is, 27 years later, quantum computing has made a great deal of progress, but it's still just around the corner. Okay, and I'm not going to say that it's never going to happen, but I am going to say it's taken place at a lot slower rate than a lot of people expected 25 years ago. Why? Because the engineering for quantum is extremely finicky. You have to get a lot of things right. By contrast, whereas you get finicky technologies in all the other domains. In all the other domains, we've managed to take a finicky process and apply it to more and more eaches, okay? The technologies, for instance, for making integrated circuits are, if anything, much more complicated than they were 25, 30, 40 years ago. But each transistor is now far, far cheaper than it was because we've taken the same finicky technologies and applied them over an ever-increasing N, where N is the number of transistors, or if you're talking gene splices, I mean, reading genetic sequences, N is the number of genes that you can sequence for a given process. Okay? So in many ways, that's how we go down market. But there are a lot of reasons to believe that quantum physics may resist that trend. On the other hand, there are lots of technologies that never go down market, and we manage to get increasing use out of them. One of them, for instance, is rocketry. The cost of getting a pound of stuff into space between essentially the 1980s and until recently did not go down. But because electronics were shrinking, we were able to get more and more usage out of a technology that did not get cheaper and cheaper. Okay? The parallel here would be that as more and more of us can take advantage of cloud computing, the fact that we don't own clouds, individuals don't own clouds and never will, doesn't necessarily mean that individuals cannot profit from advances in the field of clouds. Okay, so that's one option. The second option, and next slide, is to say that it's going to go down market on its own. Okay, we've already seen with integrated circuits and genetics, basically reading the genome, that in fact that capability exists. But even if you look at yesterday's technologies, such as cars and planes and appliances, and even out-of-season produce, you see a steady progression from technologies that only institutions and the affluent to afford to technologies that everyone can afford. Okay, and that's been a general trend throughout the 20th and into the 21st century. Okay, so the down market is not going to be from the rich to the poor in this case, but from powerful, well-funded, sensitive institutions to those which are competitive, parsimonious, which means they don't have a lot of money, and less sensitive. So again, we can talk about cloud-based security, managed services, multi-factor security, okay? That having been said, there's going to be a lot in cybersecurity that does not go down market for the reasons that I suggested. That is to say, you have, say, in the intelligence community, a set of unique problems that are not experienced in the rest of the world, so that the solutions to the intelligence community have little applicability to the rest of us. Okay, the next slide is essentially going to be talking about a third option, which is to say, to push it downstream. And here I'm going to completely, using a baseball metaphor, spitball the next thing I'm going to say. And that is, if you can find some way, and don't ask me how, of taking these quantum technologies and putting them on the chip level, you not only have a path to a steadily decreasing cost, but you also have a path to a much broader set of uses. And in this way, the technologies of quantum sensing and quantum communications can start to converge. But that's all I want to say on the topic, because like I said, I'm spitballing. Okay, what are the tools for getting things down market? They're all the usual tools. Research and development, concentrated purchases, regulation, standardization, tools that people know very well. Okay, so what's the bottom line on this on the last chart? And that is, quantum communications is an exciting technologies. It has niche applications today, but it might have more applications in time. And on that, I pass the microphone.
Thank you so much, Martin, especially for explaining in non-technical language what the quantum communication is about, so even policy people can understand. And of course, the paper is much more richer than you were able to cover. But just before we go to Jason, I just wanted to ask something that was in the paper regarding how to use quantum communications for securing wireless tapping. And you mentioned that as the technology advances and integrated circuits and chips become minimized, so we saw this happening, and now we have all cell phones and IoT devices. So I think in the paper you also referenced that this could happen in the future, and I was wondering if you could a little bit elaborate on that. Did you mean that we could use quantum communications for example, securing sensing and computing in the edge? Did I understand correctly? Thank you.
Well, look, I hate to be a disappointment here, but it's really speculation on my part. It's not more of a, it's more of a necessary condition than a sufficient condition. In other words, if there was ways to do it, it would open a lot of opportunities. I can't prove that you couldn't do it, but I'm holding out a speculation that you might be able to do it. Okay, one of the problems of quantum communications as currently implemented and as necessarily implemented is that it takes an extremely clean medium so that all the other interferences on that passing of a bit or a photon can be are nullified out, okay? And then you're basically saying, okay, I know I've gotten rid of all the interferences. Any other interference is evidence of interception. How exactly this goes away when you talk about working at the chip level, I can only speculate. So I apologize for that.
Thank you. That was very interesting, and we have to look forward. So, but as we are running soon out of time, we now move on to Jason, and after that we come back to Martin as well with more questions on the policy side and how to actually implement those brilliant recommendations in your paper. Jason, the floor is yours, please.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for the introduction earlier, and hello to you all. I'm looking forward to discussing my paper on the global spread of cyber forces from 2000 to 2018. There are two motivating questions behind this paper. The first is, how have military cyber forces spread over time, and how have they been structured? So essentially, what is the state of play with regard to formal organizations for cyber capabilities? Now, why should this matter for NATO? There are three primary reasons, but this boils down to the fact that the data suggest it is past time to update the strategic concept with regards to cyberspace. In fact, the 2010 strategic concept only mentions cyberspace 5 times. Additionally, as recommended by the NATO 2030 group, should the alliance undertake comprehensive net assessment efforts, cyber forces necessarily need to be part of this conversation. So by cyber forces, this paper defines them as active duty military organizations with the capability and authority to direct and control strategic cyberspace operations to influence diplomatic and/or military interactions. While previous studies have restricted their scope to those that possess offensive capabilities, this paper takes a little bit broader review and incorporates defensive, exploitation, and attack operations. Importantly, this excludes 3 types of organizations with similar missions. The first is civilian intelligence agencies like the United States National Security Agency. Despite significant overlap in the types of operations they conduct, civilian organizations fall outside military chains of command and tend to prioritize information collection over gaining strategic advantages on the battlefield. Second, this also excludes purely reservist components, as their activation is conditional on legal activation. And they're also much more fluid, and substantial volunteering requirements that's an assumption unlikely to hold across militaries. Finally, this includes or excludes military computer emergency readiness teams, incident response teams, et cetera, as they tend to work defensively at the tactical level. While they can be under the control of or report to cyber forces, in and of themselves, they do not constitute cyber forces. So the natural question is then, why force structure? Well, on the one hand, force structure helps to shape the trade-off of exploitation versus disruption in cyberspace. For example, those cyber forces that are traditionally rooted within military intelligence circles may have a preference for exploitation, while those originating in service-based constructs may have a preference for disruption in cyberspace and producing effects. Additionally, academics and practitioners hold many assumptions about military emulation, i.e. the tendency for military organizations to conform to a predominant organizational construct over time. Unfortunately, this assumption leaves us without an appropriate terminology for understanding the spread of cyber forces. And indeed, by referring to all institutional arrangements at cyber commands, this masks important variation in the scope, roles, and responsibilities in cyberspace. If we use Cyber Command to refer to US Cyber Command as well as any other institution, there are going to be differences that are masked. And finally, existing research has focused more on the degrees of organizational maturity for cyber forces, single case studies, or limited case comparisons of force structure. As such, we lack large-in cross-national data for comparison over time. There are several challenges, however, to assessing force structure in cyberspace. Many of the traditional categories become problematic. First, unlike unit functions in other domains, such as aircraft carriers, submarines, long-range bombers, tanks, the operational functions in the cyber domain can be nearly indistinguishable. In this sense, it doesn't really make sense to talk in terms of defensive and offensive units for cyberspace or defensive and offensive capabilities, because attacking and defending one's own network can rely on intrusions into an adversary's network for intelligence collection that would make defense much more effective. Additionally, these operations, exploitation, defense, and attack, also use similar tools and techniques. Second, the weaponry is different. Instead of tangible weapon systems, such as missiles, tanks, submarines, that have multiple usability and are quantifiable, weapons in the cyber domain are largely digital, contain transitory elements that only have a temporary ability to access and attack computer networks and systems. These capabilities also have the potential to rapidly diffuse to others and can be modified and redeployed. Third, while total personnel can be quantified to some degree, there's no clear distinction between direct combat and indirect support personnel in the cyber domain. Indeed, indirect roles such as signals intelligence are directly at the heart of operations for direct personnel in cyber forces. And finally, data across countries is at best inconsistently documented and at worst classified on force structure. Therefore, this paper proposes two main dimensions for assessing force structure, and these are organizational model and scale of command. So this slide presents the typology proposed in the paper with the two main dimensions. In the first column are organizational models, while the rows are scale of command. So all the way on the left, there are three possible values for organizational models, three options. Under a branch model, such as the Estonian Cyber Command, authority for cyberspace rests in primarily logistical branches, military intelligence agencies, signal corps, any organization that falls outside service department chains of command. Their personnel are generally arranged along functional lines. Their first identification is not a combat service. Second, for the service model, cyber forces under this model are organized when one single combat service, such as an army, a navy, an air force, or in some cases a standalone cyber service, such as Germany's Cyber and Information Domain Service, when a single service retains the primary authority for operations. In these instances, a cyber force is only staffed by the personnel from that combat service to which it reports. And usually this force is grouped according to functional or component commands or service level major commands. Finally, the third option under the branch, or excuse me, under the organizational model is a joint model. And this entails the shared distribution of authority across two or more combat services. So for instance, a construct that entails cyber operations jointly across Army, Air Force, and Navies. These joint forces rely on combat services for staffing and funding, and this usually occurs on a short-term rotational basis. If we look at these scales of command running across the top of the table, actually beginning with unified forces all the way to the right, these are independent branches, services, or combatant commands dedicated to cyber operations. Unified forces have no direct parent organization, and instead they report directly to the chiefs, ministers, or secretaries of defense. Moving to the left, sub-unified force structures are generally specialized sub-organizations treating cyber operations as an independent mission set. These sub-unified forces will report to unified commands that are already established. And finally, the last value moving again to the left is subordinated cyber forces. And this appears when existing commands tend to incorporate cyberspace operations into existing missions to support them and in attempts to enhance effectiveness. These generally report to sub-unified, but in rare cases, unified parent commands. So to just briefly survey the findings of the paper, they're broken up comparing NATO member states to the rest of the world, non-NATO countries. The first slide represents the aggregate and relative growth of cyber forces worldwide. The graph on the left portrays aggregate growth, while the graph on the right shows the relative or percentage growth within NATO and outside of NATO. Worth noting in the left-hand side of the slide on the first graph is that until 2004, there were only 7 cyber forces worldwide. These were the United States, Russia, China, Israel, North Korea, Greece, and Thailand, each of whom had a cyber force prior to the year 2000. By 2018, however, there were 61 cyber forces worldwide. NATO members accounted for 23 of these 61 forces. The graph on the right-hand side provides a bit more context, however, and what is immediately evident is that cyber forces have emerged at a much faster rate among NATO member states than among non-NATO countries. And this is particularly clear from 2008 to 2018, where in 2008, for NATO countries, less than 25% of NATO members had a cyber force. By 2018, nearly 80% had developed a cyber force among NATO members. Conversely, it took until 2017 for more than 25% of non-NATO countries to develop a cyber force. So growth within NATO member states has occurred at a much quicker rate. Turning to trends in organizational model, immediately you can see that in both instances, within member states on the left and outside of NATO on the right, there has been increasing variation in the organizational model used over time. While the branch model has been the most extensively used organizational model in both cases, the relative share of usage of that model has declined over time. Worth noting is that non-NATO states on the right-hand side have opted more regularly for the service model at a higher rate than NATO member states, while in contrast, NATO members have used the joint model more extensively than non-NATO states. However, again, worth emphasizing is that as of 2018, no dominant organizational model has emerged. Turning now to scales of command and the findings of the paper, as would be expected to a degree, subordinated commands have been the most prevalent scale of command over time, but again, this has seen a relative decrease in time as many existing cyber forces, their scale of commands have been elevated within militaries. However, it's clear that on average, a greater proportion of NATO member forces were able to transition from subordinated commands into subunified and unified commands at a much faster rate than non-NATO member cyber forces. Again, we see NATO members on the left and non-NATO members on the right. By 2018, nearly 40% of NATO cyber forces had transitioned into a unified command. Less than 20% remained a subordinated command. For non-NATO cyber forces, by 2018, roughly half were a subordinated command, and less than 20% had implemented a unified command. So briefly turning to some of the key empirical takeaways, the most prevalent cyber force structure from the typology table previously introduced, the most prevalent is a subordinated branch. However, in both organizational model and scale of command, increasing variation in force structure selection over time has led to a relative decline of the subordinated branch force structure. This indicates that as cyber forces have increasingly been created and elevated within militaries, this increasing variation means that no dominant paradigm has emerged. Our assumptions about military emulation and the emergence of a dominant paradigm do not hold up in this circumstance. And therefore, the evidence suggests that states have tended to tailor their cyber forces to their own respective political and military conditions. The natural question is, why has this variation occurred? Why are there these differences in force structure? Although for this particular paper, this question is outside the scope, there are some potential explanations. Most notably, the joint models and unified scales of command, on average, they tend to require greater resources, military and politically. for the NATO member states cyber forces to utilize these at a faster rate, it's not necessarily a surprise, as the largest economies in the world are disproportionately represented within NATO. And finally, as other research I've done indicates, implementation is subjected to these local conditions. Countries have implemented cyber forces in ways that work for them, indicating there's no dominant paradigm. So with that, I thank you for your time, and I look forward to questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Jason, for this. And I wanted to pick one issue. You mentioned that subordinate commands among NATO nations have been replaced by subunified or unified, and we can see this trend. And I was wondering if it's not based on your research, but if you could elaborate on this based on your experience. How does it affect the broader strategic environment? And you mentioned there are a lot of institutional, political, strategic considerations why nations opt for one or the other. And I'm thinking, could there be some kind of peer learning process? Because now then that we are more mainstreaming cyber operations into military planning. We have doctrine, we have Cyber Operations Center, we have regular exercises and gatherings of cyber commands, exercises, training, etc. So would you, if you look at in the future, and also in the context of, you mentioned this division of labor, which has been discussed all the time, especially regarding the split of Cyber Command and NSA. And for example, if we look at the persistent engagement, and in media there was a lot of speculation about dark side servers being taken down, perhaps covertly by Cyber Command. So doesn't it seem to you that as the mandate of military cyber forces is moving more towards what's traditional or classical signal kind of role, that in this regard, also the move towards unified command makes sense, because when you delegate authority for operations to the lower levels, it's possible to quickly react and respond, and also because our military and political decision makers are more comfortable in doing so, because the risk of cyber escalation is not considered as severe as before. So if you could comment on that, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for those questions. For the first, in terms of the geostrategic environment and the effect, so on one hand, geostrategic pressures are an important impetus for establishing a cyber command, or for obtaining the political capital needed at the domestic level to actually establish and implement, or increase, resources, scale of command, et cetera, to existing cyber forces. But geostrategic pressures alone cannot help you determine which force structure is right for your specific political, military, geostrategic conditions, et cetera. And in this sense, there is some peer learning that is taking place, right? This is really mostly seen in, from some of the other work that I've done, in assessing the trade-offs for, let's say there's a smaller country, a smaller military power that is looking to establish a cyber force. They have the ability to communicate and to conference with, for example, allies, partners, or other states to assess what the relative trade-offs of a joint model, a branch model, or a service model may be for their own military. So it helps to, there is a role for peer learning to help reduce uncertainty over the opportunity costs of pursuing one route of force structure over the other. And in that sense, so moving towards the question of the mandate of military cyber forces, yes, there is this signals intelligence is at the heart of military cyber operations, and I would argue that you can't have effective cyber operations without robust signals intelligence capabilities. On one hand, moving towards a unified command and those signals intelligence, that the role of that does help to give greater attention, greater resources, and the focus towards integrating those digital capabilities into more analog operations with other traditional kinetic domain operations. It gives the ability to try and integrate those more effectively than siloing or isolating cyber capabilities in a subordinated structure. But at the same time, the natural key question of when you sort of elevate a command to a unified command and they do start taking on these signals intelligence roles traditionally played by civilian intelligence agencies, how do you deconflict and or coordinate those operations? Civilian intelligence agencies, again, are most likely going to prioritize intelligence collection and network exploitation over potentially the preferences for disruption owned by the military. So that's the next step. The next question that needs to be asked is, as these cyber forces are increasingly elevated and taking on a larger and larger scope of responsibility, how do you deconflict that with the ongoing missions of civilian intelligence agencies? The dual hat arrangement between U.S. Cyber Command and the National Security Agency is one way of trying to address that, but it's not the only way. And we see with the United Kingdom's National Cyber Force that they constructed, that's another approach. So hopefully that addressed both of those questions.
Yes, thank you very much for that. And I assume the United Kingdom's force is joint and also unified, right? If I'm because it's composes of MOD and signals unit under the.
I would push back on that a little bit in the sense that it contains a military component. The cyber component that reports to Strategic Command is a part of the National Cyber Force. However, the organization, the National Cyber Force itself, is composed of parallel civilian capabilities. So this is, I would say, it does not fall within the typology that I offer. It is a next step, right? The next step is how can we create and assess the ways in which states have institutionalized cooperation and deconfliction between civilian and military elements. So I would say that the joint military structure contributing to the National Cyber Force is part of the equation, but the other part of the equation is with GCHQ and all the other civilian elements, it's an entirely new construct in the context of my paper.
Thank you very much. And before we turn to audience questions to Martin, there are a couple of questions from audience to you, Jason, and one of them is the role about civilian contractors, as many military structures include those. And I guess in your paper, you included reservists and also non-state actors. So should they be part of the active forces, or is there any characteristic in the typology you looked? How do states approach that?
That's great. That's a great question. And I would respond in the sense that while civilian contractors or non-state actors that may be affiliated with governments or carrying out operations on behalf of governments, I would argue that they do not constitute the primary military cyber force definitionally with what I'm advancing. However, One thing that you cannot capture in the quantitative work that I've done in this paper that would require qualitative assessment or case study is, okay, when we have a principal military cyber force within a country, what are the relations or how are those connections being utilized to non-military actors, right? You could say the same thing with reservists, right? Definitionally, I would argue that reservists do not constitute the primary military cyber force, but they can be part of the primary military cyber force. So this is getting into some conceptual and definitional exclusions, but they are important to include, and this does require additional qualitative casework. And there are some people that have done work on sort of what you would call the outsourcing of military operations or cyber operations to the civilian elements, in some cases for plausible deniability. So I would say they don't constitute cyber forces according to my definition, but they are part of the equation that needs to show up qualitatively.
Yes, that's correct. And also to just remind what you said about the analytical challenges in finding actually information about that. And of course, expert interviews are one way to do that. And now I would like to turn to Martin. There have been a couple of questions which I perhaps can summarize. So one of them is regarding how concerned you are about the ability of quantum computers in breaking the current cryptology. And I know that in your paper it was discussed alternative quantum-resistant symmetric cryptology measures. So could you say something about that? And in addition, also, what is the effect to the state strategic power balance of ability to, on the one hand, to have quantum key distribution and safeguard security of the communications, and how does this affect the ability to actually attribute cyber attacks? And finally, it's a question about standards, and there is some work being done in international standardization organizations, but do you think, or are you afraid that China would set the standards as they are doing perhaps in the area of 5G? So thank you. Over to you.
Okay, well, thanks. Those are three really meaty questions, so let me answer them in order. First thing is, how concerned am I over being able to crack asymmetric encryptions? The folks who are in the encryption business have at least a 25-year head start over the folks in the quantum business, because it's been taking very long to get quantum computers that have enough qubits together to do any useful work. In fact, we're starting to see some applications of what's called quantum supremacy, but they're very specialized and they don't necessarily apply to encryption. So when you add the 25-year head start, the fact that they have a lot of choices, you have, at least in the United States, a belief that software methods will stay ahead of quantum computers for a long time to come. The problem in encryption is the problem you have in any highly classified intelligence measure-countermeasure contest is that you don't know what the other side is doing. You can make a guess, right? The other side is not violating the laws of physics, probably. But exactly how far they've gotten along in the mathematics is only going to be a guess. And as people in the encryption business will understand, you have to make some very serious worst-case assumptions about what the other side can do in order to feel at all secure about what you are doing, and even then you're not going to feel all that secure. Okay, second question you asked was about state power. There is a great deal of concern that China has made a lot of progress in the area of quantum communications. That believe they have a dedicated satellite. They have some serious long-range fiber optics work. We have to take that seriously. But that doesn't necessarily mean that from a strategic and policy point of view, we have to copy what they do. Okay, you can never afford to ignore the technological paths that other countries go down, but that doesn't necessarily prove that you should go down the same path. Okay, I mean, DARPA used to say the only way to predict the future is to invent it. It's not a bad guide for how you do policy, for how you do technological development. So we can't ignore it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be in a race with these guys for quantum communications. Okay, it depends on our needs, not their needs. And in any case, any particular technology, generally speaking, is down the stack of all the factors that determine national power and comparative national power. Okay. The third thing you talked about is standards. We have seen, as you have indicated, a very aggressive stance taken by China in the development of IT standards all across the board. This is a kind of a complicated question. If you were to take a look at standards development in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, as I have done earlier in my career, you find out that on paper, it looks like, from the US perspective, that the other people are ahead because they're much more fully involved in the standards process. It used to be a complaint from the United States that standards processes were dominated by Europeans because every country got one vote, and the European telephone and telegraph companies basically could outvote the United States. Okay, well, it turns out that's not where internet standards came from. They came from a voluntary effort developed by people who had experience in the technology. These days, most of our de facto standards come from the usage of those folks who have dominant market positions. And I don't expect that to change. When it comes to quantum communications, however, it's not entirely clear at this stage, and the key words here are at this stage, that you really need a lot of standards to make the technology work. First, you have to fundamentally make the technology work, okay? And that's going to be a development within individual countries, within individual military alliances such as NATO, so on and so forth, okay? And since you're spending most of your time in quantum communications talking to yourself, in other words, for parts of the military, the intelligence community, to talk to other parts of the military intelligence community, global standards are not all that important, okay? The demand for us to talk in a highly secure method to the Chinese is probably less important than our ability to keep the Chinese from understanding what we're doing when we talk to others using highly classified methods. Okay, so you never want to ignore standards, but it's not going to be a central driver here, at least not at this point.
Thank you very much. And now when we have less than 2 minutes left, first of all, I would like to thank you very much for the very interesting discussion. But the final question from me that has been bugging me and coming back to the broader discussion about emerging and disruptive technologies, and also, Jason, I would welcome your opinion. What should we do to counterbalance Chinese influence, especially in those areas of technologies relevant to cyberspace as AI, data analytics, and quantum? And how do we achieve this truly transatlantic cooperation? And we discussed with Martin before how much EU has invested into this and has achieved really impressive achievements, so to speak, 1 billion euros during the next 10 years. Also already working quantum internet and quantum communications prototype or rudimentary versions. So what is your quick takeaway for the policymakers in NATO? So maybe we start from Jason. Thank you.
So just very quickly, because I would have a lot to say on this, but unfortunately we're running out of time. 2 quick points. One, the further development of technical and training standards among NATO and the EU, that is low-hanging fruit. And second, I would say, is work to develop the human capability and human capacity within militaries. Consultations among allies within NATO are not likely to share cyber weapons due to their nature, but they are much more likely to work on developing partnered and allied skills. So the transference of skills, not necessarily technology, looks like a fruitful avenue for the future.
Martin?
Yeah, let me chime in. I spent part of my misspent career hanging out with DARPA and the folks at In-Q-Tel. And without revealing any state secrets, let's say the technology transfer is very, very difficult when you have an R&D community on the one hand and the user community, say in the military or the intelligence community, on the other hand. And most of what you develop, even though it meets the needs of technologists, has a difficult time transitioning to the field. Okay? And this is an area where the same institution owns the technologists and owns the military folks. When you talk about NATO technology, you have one further remove. Okay, you have one more barrier to get from one to the other. So although I think that NATO R&D is better than no R&D, for the purposes of taking up technology, it's a little bit harder. It's a little bit harder.
Thank you very much, Martin and Jason. And this was excellent discussion. Thank you, everyone, for joining us and for your questions. And we end here and see you next time.